It was early spring in 2019 when Julia Thompson and her 5-year-old son, Lucas, moved into what they hoped would be a fresh start. The past few years have been grueling. Julia's divorce left her juggling 2 jobs and a heap of debt. She needed a place close to work and school, something affordable, even if it wasn't perfect. That's how they ended up in a 1-bedroom apartment in a quiet but slightly run-down part of town. The building itself was an old brick structure from the 1960s. Its exterior was dull and chipped, with ivy creeping along the cracks in the mortar. The apartment 2B was modest. The living room was small, but had a large window overlooking the street below. The kitchen was narrow, with ancient appliances and a distinct musty smell Julia couldn't quite place. The bedroom, though, was the most peculiar. It was plain with white painted walls, but Julia noticed faint discolorations near the corners, like something had bled through the paint. "Is it big enough for us, Mommy?" Lucas asked, clutching his stuffed dinosaur as they stood in the bedroom. Julia smiled down at him. "It's perfect, sweetheart. We'll make it cozy." The landlord, Mr. Carter, stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. He was a wiry man in his late 50s, his thinning hair slicked back. "So, you're sure this works for you?" he asked, his voice curt. "Yes," Julia replied quickly. "It's perfect for us." Mr. Carter nodded, but Julia noticed the way his gaze lingered on the bedroom walls before he left. It made her uneasy, but she dismissed it. After all, the rent was cheap and beggars couldn't be choosers. That night, as she lay in bed next to Lucas, she couldn't shake the feeling that the room felt off. The air was thick, and there was an unsettling silence, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath. She told herself it was just the stress of the move and closed her eyes, forcing herself to sleep. Two weeks later, the first nightmare came. "Mommy!" Lucas's scream cut through the stillness of the night, jolting Julia awake. She fumbled to turn on the bedside lamp, her heart racing. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked, pulling him in her arms. His small body was trembling, his face pale. "There's a lady," he whispered, his voice shaking. "A lady? Where?" Julia asked, glancing around the room. Lucas pointed to the corner near the dresser. She was standing there crying. "She looks sad, Mommy. Really sad." Julia's stomach tightened. "It's just a bad dream, sweetheart. There's no one here but us." Lucas nodded hesitantly, but he didn't let go of her for the rest of the night. The nightmares became a nightly occurrence. Lucas would wake up screaming, his descriptions of the lady growing more vivid with each passing night. "She has dark hair, and her clothes are all ripped," he said one morning over breakfast. "There's red stuff on her dress, like paint, but she's not scary, Mommy. She's just sad." Julia frowned. "Did you see something like that on TV?" Lucas shook his head. "No, I see her in my room. She stands by the dresser every night." Julia tried to reassure herself that it was just Lucas's imagination, but the details he shared unsettled her. One night, as Lucas slept beside her, she stayed awake, staring at the dresser. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She told herself there was nothing there, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. The phone call came on a chilly morning in October. Julia had just dropped Lucas off at school when her phone buzzed. "Mrs. Thompson?" a woman's voice said. "Yes, this is Julia. This is Mrs. Harper, Lucas's teacher. I wanted to discuss something with you. It's about something Lucas said in class today." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "Is he okay?" "He's fine," Mrs. Harper reassured her. "But he said something that concerned us. He told his classmates that you were dead." Julia froze. "What?" He described your bedroom as being covered in blood. Mrs. Harper continued carefully. He said there was blood on the walls, the bed, and the floor. The details were very specific. Julia felt her throat tighten. He's been having nightmares lately, she explained weakly. I think maybe he's just imagining things. Perhaps, Mrs. Harper replied. But it might be worth talking to him. That evening, Julia sat Lucas down on the couch. Lucas, she began gently. Your teacher told me what you said at school today. Why did you say those things about me? Lucas looked at her with wide eyes. I didn't lie, Mommy. I just told him what I saw. What you saw? Julia asked, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded. The lady showed me. She said it happened in our room. A long time ago. Julia's blood ran cold. What happened, Lucas? Lucas hesitated, clutching his dinosaur tightly. She said she got hurt, really bad, by a man who was supposed to love her. Julia couldn't sleep after her conversation with Lucas. His words, she said she got hurt, really bad, by a man who was supposed to love her, echoed in her mind. It wasn't something a 5-year-old would invent on his own, and the chilling accuracy of his descriptions left her questioning the apartment's past. The next morning, as Lucas played quietly in the living room, Julia took a deep breath and walked down the hall to Mr. Gerald's door. She knocked hesitantly, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open, and the elderly man peered out. Mrs. Thompson, he said, surprised. Is everything all right? Can I talk to you about something? Julia asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Mr. Gerald stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. His apartment was a stark contrast to hers, filled with old furniture, faded photographs, and the comforting smell of coffee. Julia sat down on the worn sofa, her hands fidgeting in her lap. It's about my apartment, she began. Lucas has been having nightmares, and he's been saying things he couldn't possibly know. Mr. Gerald's face darkened. You're in 2B, aren't you? Julia nodded. What do you know about it? He sighed heavily, sinking into the armchair across from her. I figured someone would ask me about it eventually. That place has always had bad energy. Bad energy? Julia echoed. Mr. Gerald nodded. It started about 10 years ago. Linda Wells lived there. She was a sweet girl, in her 20s, always polite. But she had a boyfriend, Marcus, a real piece of work. He was loud, angry, always causing trouble. We all knew he hit her, but she'd always make excuses for him. Julia leaned forward, her stomach tightening. What happened to her? Mr. Gerald's expression turned grim. One night, we heard them fighting. It was worse than usual, screaming, glass breaking. Then it went quiet. The next morning, the police were here. They found her in the bedroom, by the dresser, stabbed to death. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Did they catch him? He ran, but they found him a few days later. He's in prison now, Mr. Gerald said. But after that, no one stayed in that apartment for long. Strange things kept happening. People heard crying, saw shadows. One tenant even claimed they woke up with scratches on their arms. Julia's breath caught. Why didn't anyone tell me this when I moved in? Mr. Gerald looked at her apologetically. Landlords don't have to disclose things like that unless someone asks. Mr. Carter's not exactly forthcoming about the history of this place. Julia left the conversation shaken. That evening, she decided to do some digging of her own. She searched online for Linda Wells and Marcus Turner. It didn't take long to find the articles. Headlines like "Woman brutally murdered in her apartment" and "Boyfriend arrested in connection with stabbing" popped up immediately. The articles detailed how Linda had been planning to leave Marcus, but he discovered her plans. During an argument, he lost control and attacked her. Julia stared at a photo of Linda, a smiling young woman with long dark hair, and felt a lump rise in her throat. Later that night, Julia confronted Lucas again. "Lucas, the lady you've been seeing," she said softly. "Does she tell you her name?" Lucas nodded. "She said her name is Linda. She told me not to be scared, but she's sad, Mommy. She's really sad." Julia felt her heart sink. "Did she say why?" "She said no one listens to her," Lucas replied. "She just wants someone to help her." Julia couldn't stay another night in the apartment. The weight of what had happened there, combined with Lucas's vivid encounters, was too much to bear. She began packing their belongings, determined to leave as soon as possible. As she folded clothes into a suitcase, Lucas sat on the bed, watching her silently. "Are we moving, Mommy?" he asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Julia said, forcing a smile. "We're going somewhere new." Lucas didn't seem upset. Instead, he tilted his head, as if listening to something Julia couldn't hear. "What is it?" she asked. "She says thank you," Lucas said simply. "Linda?" Julia whispered. Lucas nodded. "She said you're helping her. She's not scared anymore." That night, as they finished packing, strange things began to happen. The dresser creaked, as if it were shifting on its own. The overhead light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then, Julia heard it, a faint, muffled sobbing coming from the corner of the bedroom. She froze, clutching Lucas's hand. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Lucas nodded. "It's her. She's saying goodbye." Julia felt tears sting her eyes. "Linda," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "If you're here, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I hope you can find peace." The sobbing stopped, and for the first time in weeks, the room felt still, calm. The next morning, as they loaded the last of their belongings into the car, Julia spotted Mr. Carter standing near the building. She marched over to him, her anger boiling over. "Why didn't you tell me about this apartment's history?" she demanded. Mr. Carter looked startled. "I didn't think it was relevant." "Not relevant?" Julia snapped. "My son has been seeing things, hearing things. You knew what happened here, and you didn't say anything." Mr. Carter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I'm sorry. I just thought it's been years. I didn't think it mattered anymore." "It matters," Julia said firmly. "To her it matters." Mr. Carter's face paled. "Her?" Julia didn't answer. She turned and climbed into the car, determined to leave the apartment and its ghosts behind. As they drove away, Lucas looked out the window and waved. "Who are you waving at?" Julia asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "The lady," Lucas said with a small smile. "She's happy now, Mommy. She says thank you for listening." Julia felt a shiver run down her spine, but didn't say anything. A few weeks later, Julia decided to visit Linda's grave. She brought flowers, placing them gently on the headstone. "I don't know if you can hear me," Julia said quietly, "but I wanted to let you know you're not forgotten. Someone cared about your story." As she stood there, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, and Julia swore she felt a light, comforting touch on her shoulder. For the first time since moving into 2B, she felt at peace.